At 5:12 in the early morning of November 20th, 2025, Ukraine's ground radar screen suddenly flared as if someone had dragged a knife along the forest edge. Against the static clutter, a band of dense metallic echo clung to the tree line, stretching for several kilometers, the kind of signal any artillery officer would recognize as something far heavier than trucks, a solid mass of armored steel. Beneath the canopy, a Russian tank battalion, a mix of T-72B3 and T-90M, the kind of steel hammer designed to punch through defensive lines and crush an entire second-line village cluster within a few minutes if it gained speed, pressed itself into a dark strip like an armored serpent coiling tight against the tree line. Waiting to lunge into the open field, lights off, engines throttled to minimum, exhausts muffled, the crews believed the foliage, humidity, and early morning shadows would blind any UAVs circling above. But in the C2 bunker, Ukrainian radar saw something else. A sequence of stationary, high-return metal signatures aligned like a ruler stroke, in other words, a perfect target strip for an artillery wipeout. As the console clock counted down 120 seconds to the first salvo, the tree line was no longer a refuge. It had become the coordinate frame of a kill box that had just been locked. Within a few dozen seconds of the metallic signature stabilizing on radar, the operations map in the C2 bunker zoomed out. The tree line where the Russian tank battalion was compressing wasn't some anonymous patch of green. It sat directly on the eastern Kupiansk attack axis, the direction Moscow intended to use armored forces to fold Ukraine's defensive line and open a route toward the urban cluster and depots on the western bank of the Oskil River. Ahead of the tree line lay an open field stretching nearly 3 kilometers. Behind it, only a few minutes of maneuvering away, sat the cluster of field depots, ammunition loading points, and the paved road that kept the logistics rhythm for this entire defensive sector. If the armored spearhead broke across that gap, both the depots and the junction would fall within Russia's direct fire range, a breach capable of paralyzing Ukrainian logistics on the Kupiansk axis for weeks, possibly months. At the same time, the sensor layer on the western ridge began seeing in a way the Russians had not anticipated. Under the canopy, it was still dark, but the thermal baseline along the tree line swelled steadily with the rhythm of throttled engines. Infrared cameras fused their data with ground radar. The entire unified feed was pushed into the artillery C2 network, where Crab, PZH-2000, and 2S-19 batteries were already locked in firing posture. With a single adjustment, the system divided the tree line into 300 to 400 meter segments, each cell lit up on the screen as a target to process. From Ukraine's perspective, the hiding line Russia believed was invisible now stood upright like a red stroke, a kill box several kilometers long, closing cell by cell, waiting for artillery to turn those metallic reflections into real explosions on the ground. The firing order slipped across Ukraine's C2 network, and the entire artillery line swung into firing mode. On the western site, the Crab 155mm battery made its final correction. The barrel rose to nearly 51 degrees, optimized for 23 to 26 kilometers. Farther south, the PZH-2000 platoon pulled the latches. The autoloader hissed as it fed M171 rounds into the chamber rounds designed to maximize fragmentation on contact with the tree line. On the nearer line, the 2S-19 Mista S 152mm guns rotated their turrets, locking 19.4 kilometers on the firing tables. The moment the first salvo left the barrels, the artillery line flashed like 3 arcs of electric light. Crab maintained 4 to 6 rounds per minute. PZH-2000 held 8 to 10 per minute in non-overheat mode, and the 2S-19 filled the gaps with heavy, booming reports. All trajectories converged on a single coordinate, the tree line where the Russian tank battalion lay compressed, waiting for orders. At a little over 20 kilometers, the first 155mm shells slammed into the tree line at 800 to 900 meters per second. The blast produced a fragmentation kill radius of 50 to 70 meters, shredding low brush and sending pressure waves deep into the canopy. A swath of forest heaved upward as if torn from the soil, then collapsed into fine debris. Tree bases crashed down. Wet earth ripped apart in bright streaks on thermal cameras. The concealment line Russia had prepared for days was erased in the first seconds of the salvo. Inside the T-72B3 and T-90M hulls, the crew saw nothing but darkness. Hearing only blasts reverberating through the composite armor, stabilizers flickered from shock. By tactical habit, many assumed this was mere suppression fire, the kind meant to rattle troops before an assault. They held position, engines low, waiting for the radio to deliver the next command. But in the Ukrainian C-2 bunker, the picture was colder. Ground radar extremely sensitive to heavy targets registered clear changes. Outer line echoes fractured into patches, mixed with white specks, signs of snapped trees and disturbed metal. Infrared cameras on the ridge returned 2 abnormal hotspots, likely T-72B3s struck in the engine compartment by fragments. C-2 immediately adjusted firing data. The second salvo was ordered 30 to 40 meters deeper into the canopy, keeping the pre-built 300 to 400 meter kill box cells. Batteries updated their elements within seconds. PZH 2000 via automated fire control, Crab via new data link, and 2S19 via manual recalculation using freshly updated meteorological data. This salvo was no opener, but a true cut. Shells detonating low, steel fragments scything into the exact points where radar still saw metal signatures, making the tree line on the tactical map appear like a steel ruler being shaded darker with each strike. After 2 salvos, the tree line had turned into a band of smoke, soil, and shredded armor. But what Ukraine needed was not a kill count. It was forcing the Russian battalion to react, stay still, and the kill box would grind them down, move even slightly toward the forest edge, and radar would catch the signature instantly, the exact moment when the jaws of the trap would begin to close. The second salvo had barely faded, the forest still shaking from the aftershocks, when an internal order snapped over the Russian battalion's radio net. Move disperse. The voice was buried in static, but clear enough to stay still for a few dozen more seconds, and they would become fixed targets. The terrain turned against them immediately. The tree line offered only 3 natural gaps, each roughly 30 to 50 meters wide enough for 2 tanks side by side, but nowhere near enough for more than 30 heavy vehicles trying to break out at once. As the first tank crept forward, its track slipped in the shell-torn mud and clipped a T-72B3 behind it, throwing the whole column's rhythm off and forcing the rear to brake hard. At the northern gap, a T-90M tried to power through, engine revs climbing to around 1,100 to 1,200 RPM. Tracks flinging mud outward, fallen trees and shell craters forced the crew to slow, pivot the turret to see the path, and edge through a gap barely wider than the hull. On Ukraine's screens, every move was obvious. Ground radar showed velocity vectors bending toward the forest edge, metal signatures drifting from under the canopy, exactly the motion the C-2 algorithm was waiting to lock. On the C-2 display, the solid echo along the tree line broke into small, bright points, individual tanks trying to bolt from the kill box. The artillery coordinator switched to intercept fire, prioritizing targets with strong lateral movement and marking all 3 tree line gaps as hot gates, each with its own blocking fire packet. Crab received updated firing data, angle up by 0.12 mil, range shortened to around 21 kilometers to cap the forest mouth. PZH 2000 raised the turret by about 18 to 20 mil, shaving flight time below 45 seconds to catch the column as it writhed out of cover. When the adjustment rounds landed, the T-90M that had just edged clear of the trees was hit at once. The sight shattered. A piece of side ERA blew off. The engine compartment died. The nearly 48-ton hull froze in the open as a barrier. The T-72B3 behind it slammed brakes, its tracks sinking into the chewed-up mud. At the central gap, 3 tanks trying to go single file ran into shell-cut trenches 20 to 30 centimeters deep. The lead tank jammed mid-turn. The 2 behind were locked, turning the gap into a textbook choke point. Radar kept sweeping, drawing short, bright vectors every time a Russian tank tried to rev forward and cutting them off as artillery found them. Infrared cameras picked up flaring heat from burning fuel and hydraulic oil instead of steady engine warmth. In the C-2 bunker, the fire control officer stated the obvious to anyone who had lived under artillery. The Russian tank battalion was no longer a maneuvering formation, but clusters of vehicles trapped at the tree line mouths fixed coordinates on the map. That was when the kill box entered its second phase. Exits sealed, clusters to be crushed one by one. When the first tank froze at the tree line, the only thing that had ever let them survive artillery momentum disappeared. Once the first tanks were stuck at the tree line, Ukrainian artillery didn't slow. It changed roles. The first 2 salvos had broken the formation. From this point on, every round was fired to clean up the remaining clusters. On the radar screen, the heavy echo along the forest edge broke into 3 to 4 dense metal patches with dead gaps where the ground had been pulverized. Velocity vectors almost vanished. Only a few short flashes remained from tanks still trying to inch forward. C2 boxed and tagged each cluster, including the group blocked behind the burning T-90M, the stack of 3 tanks at the central gap, the group pulling deeper into the forest, and several smaller tracks that were likely recovery vehicles and BMPs. Within a handful of short commands, fire was reassigned. Crab took the forward cluster, using high explosive fragmentation at about 3 to 4 rounds per minute until radar showed no movement. PZH-2000 was tasked with the deeper forest, firing airburst rounds above the canopy to strip away infantry, technicians, and repair teams. 2S-19 Mista-S covered the tree line itself, where any metal reflection poking out was instantly pulled into a blocking fire pattern and hit in the first burst. At the northern gap, the first high-explosive burst detonated in front of the disabled T-90M, throwing earth and steel fragments across its hull and into the 2 T-72B3s behind it. ERA plates flew off, tracks snapped, and external sensors were crushed, turning the gap into a blackened metal plug. At the central gap, 3 near-simultaneous rounds from PZH-2000 burst overhead, scything steel fragments down onto turret roofs and external gear, shaving what remained of the trees and exposing the entire cluster. Deeper in the forest, the group that tried to reverse a few dozen meters only shifted its radar signature inward, and C2 simply dragged the kill box with it. PZH-2000 added a little range. Airburst rounds detonated above the canopy, fragments falling like a steel rain, snapping trees and spreading craters until there was no room left to maneuver tracks. Meanwhile, the Delta vehicles had almost no chance from the moment they appeared, because as soon as they edged into the tree line, they showed up as lone, bright dots on a dead background. 2S-19 needed only one correction before sending deliberate 152mm shots, each blast near a recovery vehicle, erasing another chance at an organized retreat. Above, UAVs drifted silently over the kill zone. Infrared cameras watched heat sources flare, then fade. Engine bays burning red, turrets glowing hot, then cooling into inert metal. The burning T-90M at the front cluster became just a warped steel frame. The 3 tanks at the central gap lay twisted like dumped scrap, and the deeper group went dark 1 vehicle at a time, with no sign of any breakout attempt. Within a few minutes, the radar stopped displaying velocity vectors. The battalion had become nothing but static echoes, 40 to 50-ton blocks of steel, with no remaining tactical value. On the C2 channel, the fire control officer crossed out each neutralized cluster in turn, and the final report contained only one short line that summed it up in plain language. Tank battalion. No remaining mobile targets. The tree line once chosen as the starting point of an armored thrust was now a long black scar, filled with twisted armor packed into the soil. From Ukraine's perspective, the kill box was completely closed and nothing inside could move again. Less than half an hour after the final salvo, still in the morning of November 20th, 2025, the tree line appeared through the UAV feed as a strip of earth plowed pale. The camera slid along the forest edge, capturing scattered tank hulls, some with turrets blown off, lying upside down like overturned cups, others reduced to bare frames, armor and ERA torn away, tracks twisted into clumps of useless steel. Initial estimates showed 20 to 25 tanks, destroyed or completely stripped of mobility. The rest were abandoned because no recovery route remained. At an average cost of $3 to $4 million per vehicle, the armored assets frozen within just a few dozen minutes equaled an entire tank brigade on paper, evaporated by indirect fire alone. At the operational level, losing an entire battalion on the eastern axis meant that Russia's armored breakthrough was snapped instantly. The infantry ahead no longer had a steel hammer in support, and every plan to push deeper had to halt. The battle became a warning for Russian command. Massing armor along a tree line was no longer safe in an environment saturated with radar and UAVs. For Ukraine, This was a textbook example, using nothing more than ground radar, the C2 network, and self-propelled artillery. They could wipe out an armored unit without ATGMs or airstrikes simply by forcing the enemy to stay still inside a locked kill box. The battle at the eastern Kupiansk treeline during the late November 2025 campaign ended with a cold truth. Places once considered safe assembly points for armor-thick canopy, damp soil. Forest shadow silhouettes had become clear coordinate frames for modern artillery, when ground radar, infrared cameras, and the C2 network link into a single sensor web, traditional concealment terrain loses nearly all of its value. Losing a tank battalion is not just a number, it is the loss of the ability to threaten a breakthrough on that axis for weeks, forcing adjustments across the entire operational plan. And the question for any armored commander is this: in a battlefield where every heavy movement is monitored from afar, where is there still enough room to mass a tank unit without turning it into exactly what the enemy is waiting for, a coordinate on an artillery map?